Sometimes a man can go his whole life believing he's got nobody left in this world, only to discover he was wrong all along. Clay Hartwell thought he knew what loneliness looked like after 58 years of scraping by in the Montana mountains. With nothing but his dog Dusty for company. His truck don't run, his pockets are empty, and most nights he goes to bed hungry so his dog can eat. But when Dusty starts scratching around an old storage unit behind a forgotten mining camp, Clay finds something that changes everything. Inside are letters addressed to him from a brother he never knew existed. Photographs that show faces just like his own, and secrets about his family that nobody ever told him. Turns out he wasn't as alone as he thought. But what happens when you discover family you never knew was looking for you? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows through the pine trees as Clay Hartwell stirred the coals of his campfire with a charred stick. The embers glowed orange against the grey dawn, sending wisps of smoke curling into the crisp mountain air. Dusty, a brown and white mutt with intelligent amber eyes, stretched and yawned beside the dying fire, his breath forming small clouds in the cold. Clay's hands were rough and weathered, the knuckles scarred from years of hard living. He wore the same flannel shirt he'd had on for 3 days, the fabric soft with age and countless washings in mountain streams. His jeans were patched at the knees, and his boots had seen better decades. At 58, he carried himself with the careful movements of a man who'd learned to conserve energy, to make every motion count when survival was never guaranteed. "Morning, boy," he murmured to Dusty, scratching behind the dog's ears. Dusty's tail thumped against the pine needles that served as their carpet. The dog had been Clay's only companion for 5 years now, ever since he'd found him as a shivering puppy, abandoned near a highway rest stop. They'd been taking care of each other ever since. Clay reached into his worn canvas pack and pulled out a can of dog food, generic brand, dented, but it was all he could afford. He opened it with his knife and scraped half the contents into Dusty's metal bowl. The dog waited patiently, as he always did, until Clay gave him the nod to eat. Clay watched him gobble it down, then pulled out a piece of stale bread for himself. It wasn't much, but it would have to do until he could figure out their next meal. The mountains of Montana had been home for 8 years now, ever since Clay's. Life had fallen apart in ways that still made his chest tighten when he thought about it. He'd lost his job at the lumber mill when his back gave out, then lost his small house when the medical bills piled up faster than his disability checks could cover them. His ex-wife had taken what little was left and moved to California with her sister, leaving Clay with nothing but a truck that barely ran and a growing understanding that the world didn't much care what happened to broken-down men. So he'd headed up into the high country, where a man could disappear if he wanted to, where the only sounds were wind through the trees and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. He'd learned to live off the land as much as the law allowed, fishing in the streams, gathering berries and wild onions, trading odd jobs in the small towns below for enough cash to buy dog food and the occasional tank of gas for the truck when it was running. The truck hadn't run in 4 months now. It sat beside their current camp like a rust-colored monument to better times, its engine seized up from lack of oil and too many miles. Clay had tried everything he knew to fix it, but some problems required money he didn't have, and parts he couldn't afford. So they walked everywhere now, Clay and Dusty, carrying everything they needed in the old military surplus pack that had become Clay's entire world. This particular camp sat in a clearing about 2 miles up from the old Sunrise mining camp, one of dozens of played-out operations that dotted these mountains like abandoned dreams. Clay had discovered it 3 weeks ago when he'd been looking for a sheltered spot to wait out a late spring snowstorm. The mining camp had been shut down for 20 years, but the buildings were still standing, weathered and listing, but solid enough to provide windbreak when the weather turned mean. Clay finished his meager breakfast and kicked dirt over the fire. The routine was always the same. break camp, move to a new location, set up again somewhere else. He'd learned early in his mountain life that staying in one place too long drew attention, and attention was the last thing he wanted. Park rangers, local sheriff's deputies, even well-meaning hikers who might decide he needed help. They were. All threats to the quiet life he'd built for himself and Dusty. "Come on, boy," he said, shouldering his pack. "Let's take a look around that old mining camp. Might be something useful down there." Dusty bounded ahead, his nose to the ground, following scents that only he could detect. Clay followed at a steadier pace, his eyes scanning the forest around them with the automatic wariness of a man who'd learned that trouble could come from any direction. But these mountains had been good to them, and he'd found a kind of peace among the pines that had eluded him in the world below. The path down to the mining camp was overgrown with berry bushes and young aspens, nature slowly reclaiming what man had carved out of the wilderness. Clay pushed through the undergrowth, careful not to catch his pack on the reaching branches. The sound of his footsteps was muffled by decades of fallen leaves, and somewhere nearby he could hear the whisper of water moving over stones. The sunrise. Mining camp had once housed maybe 50 men during the copper boom of the 1970s. Now it looked like something from a ghost story, a collection of wooden buildings with broken windows and sagging rooflines, all of it slowly surrendering to time and weather. Clay had explored most of the buildings during previous visits, finding little of value except for some rusty tools and a few pieces of furniture too heavy to carry away. But Dusty seemed particularly interested in something today. The dog had stopped at the edge of the camp, his ears pricked forward, his body tense with attention. He was looking toward a cluster of metal storage units that Clay had noticed before but never bothered to investigate. They were the kind of units you'd see at any self-storage facility, but these were older, their blue paint faded to gray and streaked with rust. "What is it, boy?" Clay asked, following Dusty's gaze. The dog whined softly and took a few steps toward the storage units, then looked back at Clay as if asking permission to investigate. Clay had learned to trust Dusty's instincts. The dog had led him to fresh water, warned him about bears, and once guided him away from a patch of ground that turned out to be covering an old mine shaft. If Dusty thought something was worth investigating, Clay was inclined to listen. They walked together toward the storage units. Most of them were locked tight, their rolling doors secured with heavy padlocks that had turned green with age. But one unit, set back from the others and partially hidden by a growth of mountain ash, had its door standing slightly ajar. The padlock lay on the ground beside it, its metal shackle snapped clean through. Clay approached carefully. In his years of mountain living, he'd learned that abandoned places sometimes weren't as abandoned as they appeared. Squatters, drug cookers, even other men like himself might have claimed a space and wouldn't appreciate visitors. But the silence around the storage unit was complete, except for the whisper of wind through the trees. He pulled the door open wider, the metal squealing. In protest, sunlight slanted into the dark interior, revealing shapes covered by canvas tarps and plastic sheeting. The air that drifted out smelled of dust and old paper, with an undertone of something he couldn't quite identify. Maybe old wood or leather. Dusty pushed past him and trotted into the unit, his nose working overtime. Clay followed more cautiously, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness. As the details became clearer, he could see that someone had used this space for storage. Real storage, not just dumping unwanted junk. Everything was carefully covered and arranged, as if whoever owned it expected to come back someday. Clay lifted the edge of one tarp and found himself looking at an old acoustic guitar, its wooden body gleaming dully in the filtered light. Next, to it was a cardboard box with "Personal" written across the top in careful block letters. Another box was labeled "Photos," and a third simply said "Clay." Clay's heart stopped. He stared at the box with his name on it, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Nobody knew he was up here. Nobody had known where he was for years. How could there be a box with his name on it in an abandoned storage unit in the middle of nowhere? With hands that weren't quite steady, he picked up the box. It was heavier than he'd expected, and when he shook it gently, he could hear papers shifting inside. On the side of the box, in the same careful handwriting, someone had written, "For Clay Hartwell, from your brother Thomas." Brother? Clay set the box down carefully, his legs suddenly unsteady. He sat down hard on an overturned milk crate, staring at the words as if they might change or disappear. He'd never had a brother, his father had never mentioned any other children, and his mother, well, he barely remembered his mother. She died when he was 6, and his father had never talked about her much before his own death 15 years ago. Dusty had found something too. The dog was pawing at a small object that had fallen from one of the shelves, whining softly. Clay picked it up and found himself holding a photograph, black and white, creased with age. It showed a young woman with dark hair and kind eyes, standing beside a man Clay recognized despite the decades that had passed. It was his father, but his father looked younger than Clay had ever seen him, and he was smiling in a way Clay couldn't remember ever witnessing. The woman beside him was wearing a simple dress and holding something in her arms, something wrapped in a white blanket that could only be a baby. Clay's hands were shaking now. He turned the photograph over and found more of that careful handwriting. Sarah and Jack Hartwell, 1965, with baby Thomas. Below that, in different ink as if added later, Clay's mama and daddy with Thomas aged 2 months. The world seemed to tilt around Clay. His mother's name had been Sarah, that much he remembered, but this photograph showed her with a baby that wasn't him, and the date was 1965. Clay had been born in 1967, which meant he'd had a brother named Thomas, who was 2 years older, a brother his father had never mentioned, a brother he'd never known existed. And somehow that brother had known about him, had been looking for him, had left a box with his name on it in an abandoned storage unit in the mountains where Clay had been living like a ghost for 8 years. Clay stared at the photograph until his vision blurred, feeling like a man who just discovered that everything he thought he knew about his own life was built on sand. Dusty pressed against his leg, sensing his distress, and Clay reached down to scratch the dog's ears with an automatic gesture. "Well, boy," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion, "looks like we found something bigger than we bargained for." Clay's hands trembled as he reached for the box labeled with his name. The cardboard was soft with age, but still intact, held together with layers of clear packing tape that had yellowed over the years. He peeled back the tape carefully, as if whatever was inside might crumble at his touch. The first thing he saw was a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The envelopes were addressed in that same careful handwriting, Clay Hartwell, followed by various addresses Clay recognized from his past. The apartment he'd rented after high school, the little house he'd shared with his ex-wife, even the lumber mill where he'd worked for 12 years. Someone had been tracking his movements for decades. Clay lifted the bundle with reverent care and untied the ribbon. His fingers felt clumsy and thick as he opened the first letter, dated 15 years ago. The paper rustled softly in the quiet storage unit, and Dusty settled beside him, as if sensing this was important. "Dear Clay," the letter began, "my name is Thomas Hartwell, and I believe I am your brother. I know this must come as a shock. It was a shock to me too when I first learned about you 3 years ago. Our father never told either of us about the other, but I've been doing research, and I'm certain we're family." Clay's throat tightened. He had to stop reading and take a shaky breath before continuing. "I've been trying to find you for months now. I hired a private investigator who tracked you to the lumber mill in Kalispell. But when I called, they said you'd left 2 years ago and didn't leave a forwarding address. I'm hoping this letter reaches you somehow. I live in Missoula, only about 200 miles from where you were working. We've been so close all this time and never knew it." The words blurred, As Clay read on, Thomas wrote about growing up thinking he was an only child, about finding some old papers after their father's death that mentioned another son named Clay. He wrote about hiring investigators, making phone calls, visiting old addresses. He wrote about wanting to know his brother, about having so many questions about their father and their family history. "I don't know why Dad never told us about each other," Thomas continued. "Maybe he had his reasons. But I keep thinking about all the years we lost, all the birthdays and Christmases we could have shared. I know you might not want anything to do with me. Maybe you're happy with your life the way it is. But if you're willing, I'd like to meet you. I'd like to know my brother." Clay set the letter down and stared at the photograph again. Thomas. He had a brother named Thomas who had been looking for him, who had cared enough to hire investigators and write letters and never give up searching. While Clay had been struggling through his divorce and his injury and the loss of everything he'd thought mattered, somewhere in Missoula there had been a man who shared his blood, who wanted to know him. He opened the second letter, dated a year later. "Dear Clay, I'm not sure if you got my first letter, but I'm going to keep trying. I found out you left the lumber mill because of a back injury. I'm sorry about that. I hope you're getting by okay. I managed to track you to an address in Whitefish, but when I drove up there, the landlord said you'd moved out 6 months earlier. No forwarding address again." Clay remembered that apartment in Whitefish, a cramped studio above a diner where the smell of bacon grease seeped through the floorboards. He'd lived there for 8 months after the mill let him go, trying to survive on disability payments that barely covered rent and food. It had been one of the darkest periods of his life, and to think that Thomas had been looking for him then, had driven all that way trying to find him. "I keep wondering what you're like," Thomas wrote. "Do you look like Dad? Do you have his stubborn streak? I got Mom's eyes, but Dad's hands, big and clumsy, good for working but not much else. I'm a carpenter, mostly cabinets and furniture. Not married, though I came close once. What about you? Are you married? Kids? I have about 1,000 questions and no way to ask them." Clay's chest felt tight. He'd been married then, though things with Linda were already falling apart. The injury had changed everything, not just his ability to work, but his sense of himself as a man who could provide and protect. Linda had tried to be supportive at first, but watching him struggle with depression and pain had worn her down. By the time he'd moved to that studio apartment in Whitefish, she was already talking about visiting her sister in California. The third letter was dated 2 years later, and the handwriting looked a little different, less steady, more rushed. "Clay, I don't know if you're getting these letters or if you just don't want to respond, and I understand if you don't. Maybe Dad had good reasons for keeping us apart. Maybe some things are better left alone. But I can't seem to stop looking. For you, it's become kind of an obsession, I guess. My friend Jake says I should let it go, that if you wanted to be found, you would be. But something tells me you might not even know I exist." Clay's eyes burned. Thomas was right. He'd had no idea. If someone had told him 5 hours ago that he had a brother somewhere in Montana, he would have laughed. His father had never mentioned other children, never hinted at a larger family. Clay had grown up believing he was alone in the world except for his parents, and after they died, completely alone. "I've been having some health problems lately," the letter continued. "Nothing serious, the doctors say, but it's got me thinking about time and how we never know how much we have left. I keep thinking about all the conversations we've never had, all the memories we never made. I know I'm probably being foolish, but I can't help hoping that someday we'll meet." There were more letters, dozens of them. Thomas had kept writing even when he got no response, updating Clay on his life, sharing stories about their father that Clay had never heard, asking questions that would never be answered. In one letter, he wrote about renovating an old cabin up in the mountains north of Missoula. In another, he mentioned learning to play guitar and wondering if musical talent ran in the family. "I think about you especially around the holidays. One Christmas letter said, "I wonder if you like turkey or ham better, if you're a football fan, if you ever think about family even when you don't have much of it. I cook too much food every year, hoping maybe this will be the year you show." Up at my door. I know that's crazy, but hope doesn't always make sense. Clay had to stop reading. His hands were shaking so hard he could barely hold the letters, and his vision kept blurring with tears he hadn't shed in years. Dusty whined softly and nuzzled his hand, and Clay realized he was making small, broken sounds in his throat all those years when he'd felt completely alone in the world, when he'd convinced himself that nobody cared whether he lived or died. There had been a brother in Missoula writing letters and cooking too much food and never giving up hope. While Clay had been sleeping rough in the mountains, telling himself he was better off without human connection, Thomas had been out there somewhere, wanting nothing more than to know his brother. The last letter in the bundle was different from the others. The envelope was thicker, and when Clay opened it, he found not just a letter, but a small key and what looked like a hand-drawn map. "Dear Clay," it began, "if you're reading this, then you found the storage unit. I set it up 5 years ago when I realized my letters weren't reaching you, when I figured out you might be living off the grid somewhere in the mountains. I remembered Dad talking about the old mining camps up there, about how a man could disappear if he wanted to. So I rented this unit and filled it with things I wanted you to have, things that belonged to both of us." Clay looked around the storage unit with new eyes. Thomas had done this. His brother had rented this space, had filled it with family belongings, and memories had somehow known that Clay might end up in these mountains. "The key is to my cabin," the letter continued. "It's about 40 miles north of here, up Forest Service Road 247. The map will show you the way. I've been fixing it up for years, hoping maybe someday we could spend some time there together. But if something happens to me before I find you, I want you to have it. I want you to have a home." Clay's breath caught. A home. Thomas was offering him a home, not just shelter, but belonging, a place where he was wanted, where he mattered to someone. "I hope we get to meet face to face, Clay. I hope I get the chance to tell you all the stories I've saved up over the years, to hear about your life, to be the brother I should have been all along. But if we don't, if something happens, or if you decide you don't want family after all, I want you to know that finding out about you has been one of the best things that ever happened to me. Just knowing you exist somewhere in the world has made me feel less alone." The letter was signed simply, "Your brother Thomas," followed by a phone number and an address in Missoula. Clay sat in the quiet storage unit, surrounded by the evidence of a brother's love, and felt something crack open in his chest. Something that had been frozen solid for years. For the first time since he could remember, he wasn't alone in the world. Somewhere out there was a man who shared his blood, who had been looking for him for 15 years, who had never stopped hoping they might find each other, and Clay had no idea if Thomas was even still alive. Clay spent the rest of that day in the storage unit, reading through Thomas's letters over and over, trying to absorb the reality that he had a brother who had been searching for him for 15 years. Each letter revealed more pieces of a life Clay had never known existed. Thomas's work as a carpenter, his love of old country music, his struggles with loneliness that mirrored Clay's own. As the afternoon light slanted lower through the open door, Clay discovered more treasures hidden beneath the tarps. There was a small wooden box filled with old photographs, most of them showing people Clay didn't recognize, but who shared familiar features. The same strong jaw, the same deep-set eyes. There were pictures of family gatherings, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, all the normal celebrations of people who belonged somewhere, who mattered to each other, but it was the small, hand-carved wooden horse that stopped Clay cold. He found it wrapped carefully in tissue paper, tucked inside a cigar box, along with a few other small toys, a tin soldier missing one arm, a set of wooden blocks worn smooth with handling, a tiny leather ball that had been stitched back together multiple times. The horse was beautifully crafted, its mane and tail carved with delicate detail, its wood polished to a warm honey color from years of being held by small hands. On the bottom of the horse, scratched in a child's uneven letters, was the name, Thomas. Clay turned the toy over in his weathered hands, imagining his brother as a little boy, playing with this horse, carrying it around, maybe sleeping with it clutched against his chest. It was such a simple thing, but it represented everything Clay had missed, a childhood he might have shared, games they might have played together, the comfort of knowing there was someone else in the world who understood what it was like to be Jack Hartwell's son. A loose photograph had been tucked under the tissue paper with the horse. It showed two young boys, maybe 5 and 7 years old, sitting on the steps of a house Clay didn't recognize. The older boy had his arm around the younger one protectively, and both were grinning at the camera with gap-toothed smiles. On the back someone had written Thomas and Jimmy, 1970. Jimmy, not Clay, Jimmy. Clay stared at the photograph, his heart hammering. The younger boy in the picture looked exactly like Clay had at that age. Same unruly dark hair, same mischievous eyes. But he was called Jimmy, not Clay, and he was with Thomas, sitting together like brothers should. Clay's mind raced. If this was him in the photograph, why was he called Jimmy? And why couldn't he remember Thomas, remember sitting on those steps, remember being that happy? His earliest memories were of living with his father in the little house in Great Falls, just the two of them after his mother died. He'd never lived in the house in the photograph, had never had a brother to sit with on sunny afternoons. But the resemblance was unmistakable. The boy in the photograph had the same cowlick that still made Clay's hair stick up in the morning, the same crooked smile that Linda used to tease him about. It had to be him. But it was a version of himself he couldn't remember, living a life he'd somehow forgotten. Dusty had been napping in a patch of sunlight near the storage unit door, but now he lifted his head and whined softly. Clay looked up to see the dog staring at him with those intelligent amber eyes, as if he could sense the emotional turmoil churning in Clay's chest. "I know, boy," Clay said quietly. "This is a lot to take in." He set the photograph aside and continued exploring the box. There were more pictures of the two boys, building a snow fort, fishing from a wooden dock, helping an older woman hang, laundry on a clothesline. In every photo they were together, clearly comfortable with each other, clearly brothers in every way that mattered, but Clay couldn't remember any of it. Not the snow fort, not the fishing, not the woman who appeared in several photos, and who bore a strong resemblance to their mother. It was like looking at someone else's life, someone who happened to share his face. He found Thomas's school reports tucked in with the photographs, neat handwritten grades from a teacher who noted that Thomas was a bright boy, but sometimes distracted, seems to be looking for someone. There were drawings Thomas had made as a child, stick figures labeled Me and Jimmy, engaged in various adventures, riding horses, catching fish, fighting dragons. The picture that emerged from these childhood artifacts was of two brothers who had been inseparable, at least for the first few years of their lives. Thomas clearly remembered their time together, had treasured these mementos enough to save them for decades, had hoped someday to share them with the brother he'd lost. But why couldn't Clay remember? What had happened to separate them, and why had his father never mentioned Thomas? The questions multiplied faster than Clay could process them, each discovery in the storage unit raising new mysteries about his own past. As the sun began to set, behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the mining camp, Clay finally forced himself to step outside the storage unit. His legs were stiff from sitting on the concrete floor for hours, and his head felt thick with information and emotion. Dusty stretched and followed him, staying close as if sensing his human needed comfort. Clay walked to the edge of the camp, where he could look out over the valley below. The mountains rolled away in all directions, peak after peak, disappearing into the evening haze. Somewhere out there, maybe 200 miles south, was Missoula, and in Missoula, maybe, was Thomas. The last letter had been dated 3 years ago. 3 years was a long time, especially for a man who had mentioned health problems. Thomas could have moved, could have given up his search, could have... Clay cut off that line of thinking. He couldn't bear to consider that he might have found his brother too late, that the years of separation might have cost them the chance to know each other. Not when he was holding evidence that Thomas had never stopped hoping, never stopped believing they might find each other someday. The evening air was growing cold, and Clay knew he should set up camp somewhere sheltered for the night. But he couldn't bring himself to leave the storage unit, couldn't abandon this treasure trove of family history that Thomas had left for him. Instead, he gathered some dry wood from around the mining camp and built a small fire near the storage unit door. As darkness settled over the mountains, Clay sat beside the fire with Dusty pressed against his leg, rereading Thomas's letters. By firelight, each one was a glimpse into a life that had paralleled his own, the loneliness, the struggle to make sense of their father's silences, the deep ache of feeling incomplete without knowing why. "I dream about you sometimes," Thomas had written in one letter. "I dream we're kids again, playing in that old apple orchard behind Grandma Rose's house. Do you remember the apple orchard, Clay? We used to build forts out of fallen branches and pretend we were explorers discovering new worlds. In my dreams, we're always 7 and 5 again, and we have all the time in the world." Clay closed his eyes, trying to summon some memory of an apple orchard, of a grandmother named Rose, of building forts with a brother he'd loved and lost. But there was nothing, just darkness where those memories should have been, as if someone had carefully erased a whole section of his childhood. But Thomas remembered for both of them. Thomas had kept their shared history alive through decades of separation, had preserved the evidence of their brotherhood in photographs and toys and hand-drawn pictures. And now, somehow, that history belonged to Clay again. The fire crackled softly in the mountain quiet, and overhead the first stars were beginning to appear. Clay pulled his threadbare jacket tighter around his shoulders and reached down to scratch Dusty's ears. "What do you think, boy?" he asked quietly. "Should we try to find him?" Dusty's tail thumped once against the ground, and Clay took that as encouragement. Tomorrow he would have to make some decisions, but tonight he would sit by the fire and read his brother's letters, and for the first time in years he wouldn't feel quite so alone in the world. The next morning brought a grey sky and the scent of rain on the wind. Clay woke stiff and cold beside the dying embers of his fire, with Dusty curled tight against his back for warmth. The storage unit loomed before them like a portal into a past Clay was only beginning to understand. After sharing the last of their meager breakfast, another can of dog food split between them, Clay returned to his exploration of Thomas's carefully preserved collection. Today he found something that made his hands shake as he lifted it from beneath a protective top, a leather-bound journal with search log Clay Hartwell written on the cover in Thomas's familiar handwriting. The journal was thick, maybe 200 pages, and nearly every page was filled with notes, addresses, phone numbers, and dates. It was a detective's notebook, a systematic record of Thomas's 15-year search for the brother he'd lost. Clay opened it to the first page and found an entry dated 16 years ago. "Found Dad's papers in the attic today while cleaning out. The house. Birth certificate for a Clay James Hartwell, born June 15th, 1967, in Billings. 2 years younger than me. Same parents listed, Jack and Sarah Hartwell. How did I never know I had a brother?" Clay's breath caught. Clay James Hartwell. That was him, but he'd never known his middle name was James. And Jimmy, the name on the back of the childhood photograph. Jimmy must have been what they'd called him as a little boy, before something happened to separate him from Thomas and change his name to Clay. He flipped through more pages, watching Thomas's search unfold in careful chronological order. There were addresses in Great Falls, where Clay had lived with his father, phone numbers for schools Clay had attended, employment records from every job Clay had ever held. Thomas had been thorough, methodical, never giving up even when leads went cold. Hired private investigator Jake Morrison, read one entry from 10 years ago. He found school records showing Clay enrolled in Great Falls Elementary in 1973. No record of him before that date. It's like he appeared out of nowhere when he was 6 years old. What happened to those first 6 years? Clay felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. 6 years old, that was when his earliest memories began, living in that little house in Great Falls with his father. Before that, there was nothing but darkness and occasional flashes that felt more like dreams than memories. He'd always assumed that was normal, that most people couldn't remember being very young, but Thomas's journal suggested otherwise. It suggested that Clay had lived somewhere else for the first 6 years of his life, had been someone else, Jimmy, before. Becoming Clay, the questions that had been nagging at him since yesterday grew more urgent. What had happened to separate them? Why couldn't he remember Thomas, remember their childhood together? He found partial answers in Thomas's careful detective work. There were copies of court documents Thomas had obtained, records that painted a picture Clay was only beginning to piece together. Their father, Jack Hartwell, had been married to their mother, Sarah, but the marriage had been troubled. There were restraining orders, police reports, documentation of a relationship that had turned dangerous. Found Grandma Rose's address in Kalispell, Thomas had written. She's 89 now, in a nursing home, but her mind is still sharp. She remembers Jimmy, remembers all of us living with her after Mum died. She says Dad took Jimmy away in the middle of the night when Jimmy was 6. She tried to stop him, even called the police, but Dad had legal custody. She never saw Jimmy. Again, Grandma Rose. The name stirred something deep in Clay's memory, a feeling more than an image. The sense of safety and warm cookies, and someone who sang lullabies in a voice like rustling leaves. He closed his eyes and tried to bring her face into focus, but it remained frustratingly just beyond reach. Thomas had included a photograph he'd taken at the nursing home. An elderly woman with kind eyes and gentle hands, sitting in a wheelchair, with a lap blanket tucked around her knees. "Your Grandma Rose," Thomas had written on the back. "She cried when I showed her your picture. She never stopped hoping you'd come back to us." The words hit Clay like a physical blow. This woman, his grandmother, had been alive all these years, had been hoping for his return, and he'd never known she existed. His father had taken him away from her, from Thomas, from everyone who might have loved him, and given him the family he'd spent his whole life missing. As Clay read further into the journal, he began to understand the scope of Thomas's dedication. His brother had spent thousands of dollars on private investigators, had driven hundreds of miles following leads that went nowhere, had called every Hartwell in 3 states hoping to find some connection to Clay. He'd never given up, not even when years passed without a trace. Clay's ex-wife, Linda, called me back today, read an entry from 5 years ago. She says he disappeared after their divorce, that she hasn't heard from him in 2 years. She sounded worried about him, said the last time she saw him he was in bad shape, depressed, drinking too much, talking about wanting to disappear forever. She gave me the address of the last place she knew he was living, but the landlord there says he left without a forwarding address. Trails gone cold again. Clay remembered that conversation, remembered Linda begging him to get help, to talk, to someone about the depression that was eating him alive. But he'd been too proud, too convinced that he was better off alone. If he'd known that somewhere out there his brother was looking for him, would he have made different choices? Would he have fought harder to stay connected to the world instead of retreating into these mountains? The journal contained maps Thomas had drawn, marking every place he'd searched, every lead he'd followed. There were photographs of apartments where Clay had lived, businesses where he'd worked, all taken during Thomas's systematic investigation of his brother's life. It was like looking at his own biography, written by someone who cared more about his story than he ever had. Near the back of the journal, Clay found something that made his throat constrict with emotion. a list titled, "Things I Want to Tell Clay." When I find him. It was written in pencil, with items added over the years in different inks, as if Thomas had kept coming back to it whenever something new occurred to him. Tell him about Mom's garden, how she taught us to plant tomatoes. Show him the scar on my knee from when we crashed our bikes racing down Miller's Hill. Ask him if he still likes peanut butter and pickle sandwiches. Tell him about the time we caught that huge trout in Beaver Creek and Grandma Rose made us throw it back because it was too beautiful to eat. Show him how to play Wildwood Flower on the guitar, Mom's favorite song. Tell him he's the reason I learned to cook, because I always hoped he'd come for dinner someday. Clay had to stop reading. His vision was blurring, and his chest felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. Thomas had been carrying all these memories, all these stories for decades, waiting for the chance to share them with the brother who couldn't remember any of it. Dusty whined softly and pressed his nose against Clay's hand. The dog had been watching him read with those intelligent eyes, seeming to understand that something important was happening. Clay scratched behind Dusty's ears, grateful for the comfort of his loyal friend. The last entry in the journal was dated only 6 months ago. Health not good. Doctor says I need to slow down, but how can I stop looking for Clay now? Rented storage unit at old Sunrise mining camp. If he's living rough in the mountains like Jake thinks, maybe he'll stumble across it someday. Put everything there. All the photos, the letters, the things that belong to both of us. If something happens to me before I find him, at least he'll know he was loved. 6 months ago. Thomas had been there 6 months ago, setting up this storage unit like a message in a bottle, hoping his lost brother might somehow find it. And Clay had been living rough in these very mountains, probably within a few miles of where Thomas had been working, and they'd missed each other again. But now, Clay had found the message. Now he knew the truth about his past, about the family he'd lost, about the brother who had never stopped looking for him. The question was, what was he going to do about it? Clay looked at the phone number Thomas had written on the last page. Of the journal, the address in Missoula where his brother might still be living. 6 months wasn't that long ago. Thomas could still be there, still be hoping for the reunion he'd dreamed about for 15 years. For the first time since he'd retreated into these mountains, Clay felt the pull of the world below, the possibility that there might be something worth returning to. But the fear was there too. Fear that he was too late, that Thomas was gone, that he'd spent so many years running from connection that he'd forgotten how to accept it. Dusty stretched and yawned, then looked at Clay expectantly, as if waiting for a decision. Clay closed the journal and held it against his chest, feeling the weight of all those years of searching, all that hope and love and stubborn determination to find a brother who'd been lost. "What do you think, boy?" Clay asked quietly. "Are we ready to stop running?" Clay spent 3 more days at the storage unit, absorbing the contents like a man dying of thirst finally finding water. Each artifact told him more about the brother he'd lost and the childhood he couldn't remember, but it was Dusty who forced him back into the present. On the 4th morning, Clay woke to find his companion lying unusually still beside the cold ashes of their fire. Dusty's breathing was shallow, and when Clay called his name, the dog lifted his head with obvious effort. His usual bright amber eyes looked dull and tired. "Come on, boy," Clay said gently, reaching out to scratch Dusty's ears. "Time to get moving." But Dusty didn't bounce up with his typical enthusiasm. Instead, he struggled to his feet, swayed slightly, then lay back. Down with a soft whine. Clay's heart clenched with a familiar fear, the terror of losing the only constant in his life, the only being who had never judged him or abandoned him. Clay knelt beside his friend and ran his hands carefully over Dusty's body, checking for injuries or signs of illness. The dog's nose was warm and dry, and Clay could feel his ribs more prominently than usual. When had Dusty gotten so thin? When had Clay stopped really looking at him, stopped noticing that his companion was aging, slowing down, maybe getting sick? For 5 years, Dusty had been Clay's early warning system, his compass, his connection to hope when everything else felt lost. The dog had led him to fresh water when they were desperate, had warned him away from dangerous ground, had kept him warm on the coldest nights with nothing but his loyal presence. And Clay realized with shame that he'd been so focused on his own survival, his own pain, that he'd failed to notice his best friend might need care. Clay's worn leather collar had been with Dusty since the day Clay found him. A puppy collar that had somehow never been replaced even as the dog grew. The leather was soft with age and handling, the brass nameplate green with tarnish but still readable, Dusty, in neat capital letters that Clay had hand-engraved at a truck stop 5 years ago. Below the name, he'd scratched in his phone number, a number that hadn't worked in years, from back when he'd still believed he might want someone to find him if something happened. "You've been taking care of me all this time, haven't you, boy?" Clay said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "And I've been too wrapped up in my own problems to take proper care of you." Dusty's tail made a weak attempt at wagging, as if to reassure Clay that everything was fine, that he didn't need to worry. But Clay was worried, more worried than he'd been about anything in years. The thought of losing Dusty, of being truly alone again, made his chest tighten with panic. He gathered his few possessions and helped Dusty to his feet. The dog was willing to walk, but his usual boundless energy was gone. They made slow progress down the mountain trail, Dusty stopping frequently to rest, while Clay fought the growing certainty that his companion was seriously ill. The nearest town was Whitefish, about 15 miles down winding mountain roads that Clay would have to walk. 15 miles with a sick dog, carrying everything they owned, hoping to find help from people he'd spent 8 years avoiding. But for Dusty, Clay would do anything. They walked for hours, Clay adjusting his pace to match. Dusty's slower gait. The dog never complained, never gave up, but Clay could see the effort it was costing him. By the time they reached the outskirts of Whitefish, the sun was setting and both of them were exhausted. Clay had been to Whitefish before, of course. It was where he'd lived in that studio apartment above the diner, where Thomas had come looking for him and missed him by 6 months. Walking down the main street felt like stepping back into a life he'd deliberately abandoned. But desperation made the choice simple. Dusty needed help, and Clay's pride wasn't worth his companion's life. The veterinary clinic was in a converted house on the edge of town, with a simple sign reading, "Whitefish Animal Care, Dr. Sarah Chen, DVM." Light glowed warmly in the windows, and Clay could see people moving around inside, even though it was well past normal business hours. Clay hesitated outside the door, suddenly aware of how he must look after 8 years of mountain living. His clothes were clean but patched, his beard was long and unkempt, and he probably smelled like campfire smoke and pine needles. He had maybe $30 in his pocket, not nearly enough for whatever Dusty might need. But Dusty whined softly and leaned against Clay's leg, and that decided it. Clay pushed through the door, setting off a small bell that announced their arrival. The waiting room was warm and brightly lit, with comfortable chairs and walls covered in photos of happy pets with their families. A young woman behind the reception desk looked up from her computer, and Clay saw her take in his appearance with a quick, assessing glance that he'd learned to recognize over the years. The look people gave when they were trying to decide if he was dangerous or just down on his luck. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice professionally neutral but not unkind. "My dog," Clay said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "He's sick. I don't have much money, but—" "Let me get Dr. Chen," the receptionist interrupted, already reaching for the phone. "She's just finishing up with another patient." A few minutes later, a woman in her early 40s emerged from one of the exam rooms. She was small and compact, with graying black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore scrubs covered in cartoon cats, which somehow made Clay feel slightly less out of place. "I'm Dr. Chen," she said, extending her hand without hesitation. "And you are?" "Clay," he said, shaking her hand and surprised by the firmness of her grip. Clay Hartwell, this is Dusty. Dr. Chen knelt beside Dusty without ceremony, her hands gentle as she examined him. Dusty submitted to her touch with the patience he'd always shown, though Clay could see the effort it cost him to remain standing. "How long has he been lethargic like this?" Dr. Chen asked. Her attention focused on Dusty, but her question clearly directed at Clay. "Few days," Clay admitted. "Maybe longer. I've been distracted. Wasn't paying attention like I should have." Dr. Chen looked up at him then, and Clay braced himself for judgment, for the lecture he probably deserved about responsible pet ownership. Instead, she just nodded. "It happens," she said matter-of-factly. "Let's get him into an exam room and see what's going on. Maria, can you set up room 2? As they walked Dusty into the exam room, Clay found himself studying Dr. Chen. There was something about her that put him at ease, a no-nonsense competence combined with genuine compassion that reminded him of his grandmother Rose, though he couldn't say why since he didn't really remember his grandmother. "How old is Dusty?" Dr. Chen asked as she helped the dog onto the examination table. "About 8, I think," Clay said. "I found him as a puppy 5 years ago, abandoned at a rest stop. The vet there thought he was maybe 3 then." Dr. Chen nodded, her hands moving over Dusty's body with practiced efficiency. She listened to his heart and lungs, checked his eyes and ears, palpated his abdomen. Through it all, Dusty remained calm, as if he understood these people were trying to help. "His heart sounds good," Dr. Chen said after a few minutes. "Lungs are clear, but he's definitely underweight, and I can feel some swelling in his abdomen. That concerns me. When did he last have a full blood panel?" Clay felt heat rise in his cheeks. "He's never had one," he admitted. We've been living rough for a while. I haven't been able to afford regular vet care." He waited for the judgment, the lecture about how people who couldn't afford pets shouldn't have them. But Dr. Chen just made a note on her chart. "Well, let's start with some basic blood work and see what we're dealing with," she said. "Maria can give you an estimate for the costs. But I want you to know we have a payment plan program for people who need it. The important thing right now is figuring out what's wrong with Dusty." Clay's throat tightened. "I don't have much money," he said quietly. "Maybe $30. And I don't have an address for a payment plan." Dr. Chen looked at him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. "Let's worry about the money later," she said. "Right now, Dusty needs our help, and that's what matters." For the first time in years, Clay felt the unfamiliar warmth of human kindness offered without conditions or expectations. Dr. Chen wasn't trying to fix him or save him or make him into something he wasn't. She was just taking care of his dog, because that's what needed to be done. "Thank you," Clay said, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Chen smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "That's what we're here for," she said. "Now let's take care of your friend." The blood work took longer than Dr. Chen had expected. While they waited for the results, she set Clay and Dusty up in a quiet room with a comfortable dog bed and a bowl of water. Dusty settled down with a grateful sigh, and Clay found himself sitting in an actual chair for the first time in months. "The lab should have preliminary results in about an hour," Dr. Chen said, checking her watch. "There's coffee in the break room if you'd like some, and Maria keeps snacks in the front desk drawer. Help yourself." Clay wasn't used to such casual generosity. In his years of mountain living, every interaction with other people had been transactional. Services for money, goods for goods, help given only when something was expected in return. Dr. Chen's easy kindness felt almost foreign. "I should tell you," he said as she prepared to leave the room. "I've got nowhere to stay tonight. If Dusty needs to stay here for observation or treatment, I can sleep in my truck." Dr. Chen paused at the door. "Your truck's here?" Clay shook his head, embarrassed. "No, it's back at my camp, broke down months ago. We walked here." "You walked 15 miles with a sick dog." "He needed help," Clay said simply, as if that explained everything. Dr. Chen studied him for a moment with those thoughtful eyes. "There's a couch in my office," she said finally. "It's not much, but it's warm and dry. You're welcome to use it tonight if you need to stay close to Dusty." Before Clay could protest or ask what she wanted in return, she was gone, leaving him alone with his thoughts and his sleeping dog. Through the window, he could see the lights of Whitefish twinkling in the darkness, and somewhere beyond those lights, the mountains where he'd made his home for 8 years. But sitting in this warm, clean room, with Dusty resting comfortably nearby, Clay realized how isolated he'd become, how much he'd forgotten about the simple human decency that people like Dr. Chen offered without thinking twice about it. When had he become so suspicious of kindness? When had he decided that accepting help made him weak? Dr. Chen returned an hour later with a folder full of test results and a cup of coffee for Clay. She sat down across from him and spread the papers. On the small table, her expression serious but not grim. "The good news is it's not cancer," she said without preamble. "The bad news is Dusty has chronic kidney disease. It's fairly advanced, which explains why he's been feeling so poorly." Clay's hands tightened around the coffee cup. "How advanced?" "Stage 3, maybe early stage 4, Dr. Chen said gently. "His kidney function is significantly compromised. Without treatment, he's going to continue declining, probably fairly quickly. And with treatment," Dr. Chen leaned back in her chair, choosing her words carefully, "with proper care, medication, a special diet, regular monitoring, we might be able to slow the progression and give him a good quality of life for several months, maybe longer. But it won't cure him, Clay. This disease is progressive." Clay felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the same crushing weight he'd felt when everything else in his life had fallen apart. Dusty was all he had left, the only living being who depended on him, who chose to stay with him despite everything. The thought of losing him felt like losing himself. "How much?" Clay asked quietly. "For the treatment." Dr. Chen hesitated, which told Clay everything he needed to know even before she spoke. The initial medication and dietary changes would run about $400, then ongoing costs of maybe $200 a month for food and follow-up care. $400. Clay had $30 to his name and no way to earn more living rough in the mountains. Even if he could somehow come up with the initial cost, $200 a month was impossible. He might as well have asked for the moon. "I see," Clay said, his voice flat with defeat. "Clay," Dr. Chen said gently, "we can work something out. I told you we have payment plans." "With what address?" Clay interrupted. "What phone number?" "I don't exist in your system, Dr. Chen. I haven't had a permanent address in 8 years. I don't have credit. I don't have references. I don't have anything you could use for a payment plan." Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment, studying his face. "Tell me about your life," she said finally. "How did you end up living in the mountains with just your dog?" Clay almost laughed at the absurdity of it, this successful veterinarian wanting to hear his hard luck story like they were old friends sharing coffee. But something in her expression stopped him, some genuine interest that had nothing to do with pity or professional curiosity. So he told her. Not everything. He couldn't bear to talk about Thomas yet, about the brother he'd just discovered and might already be too late to find. But he told her about the lumber mill, about his back injury and the medical bills, about losing his house and his marriage and his place in the world. He told her about finding Dusty and learning to survive in the wilderness, about choosing isolation over the constant struggle of trying to fit into a society that had no place for broken-down men. Dr. Chen listened without interrupting, without offering platitudes or advice. When Clay finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You know," she said finally, "I could use some help around here. Nothing fancy. Cleaning kennels, walking the dogs that are boarding, basic maintenance work. It wouldn't pay much, but it would. Be steady, and there's a small apartment above the clinic that goes with the job. Previous tenant moved out last month." Clay stared at her. "You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a chance," Dr. Chen corrected. "A chance to take care of Dusty properly, to have a roof over your head, to be part of something again, if you want to be." "You don't know anything about me," Clay protested. I could be dangerous, unreliable. I've been living like a hermit for 8 years. Dr. Chen smiled, the same genuine smile she'd shown him earlier. You walked 15 miles with a sick dog because he needed help, she said. You've spent your last $30 to try to get him care. You've taken better care of that animal than most people take care of their families. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. Clay felt something crack open in his chest. Not the painful breaking he'd experienced in the storage unit, but something warmer, like ice melting after a long winter. For the first time since he'd retreated into the mountains, someone was offering him not charity, but opportunity. Not pity, but partnership. I don't know how to be around people anymore, he admitted. Most of our patients are dogs and cats, Dr. Chen said with a straight face. I think you'll manage. Despite everything, Clay found himself almost smiling. When would I start? Tomorrow, if you're willing, Dr. Chen said. We can start Dusty on his treatment right away, and you can move into the apartment whenever you're ready. There's no lease, no credit check, no paperwork beyond what we need for employment records. Just a chance for both of you to have a home. Home. The word hit Clay like a physical blow. He thought about Thomas's letters, about the cabin his brother had offered him, about all the years he'd spent convinced he didn't deserve a place to belong. Now 2 different people were offering him the same thing, a chance to be part of something, to matter to someone. Clay looked down at Dusty, who was sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. His companion had led him to Thomas's storage unit, and now Dusty's illness had led him to Dr. Chen. Maybe it was time to stop running from the possibility of connection, to start believing that he might deserve kindness after all. Dr. Chen, Clay said quietly, I need to tell you something else. Something I just found out about myself. And for the first time since discovering Thomas's letters, Clay began to talk about the brother he'd lost, the family he'd never known. He had, and the choice he now faced between the safety of Dr. Chen's offer and the uncertain hope of finding the man who had never stopped looking for him. Dr. Chen listened, and Clay realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't facing his problems alone. Dr. Chen listened to Clay's story about Thomas without interrupting, her expression growing more thoughtful as he described the letters, the photographs, and the 15-year search. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, absently stroking Dusty's head as the dog dozed between them. You said your brother's name was Thomas Hartwell, she asked finally. That's right, you wouldn't happen to know him, would you? Clay asked with a bitter laugh. Seems like he talked to half the state of Montana looking for me. Dr. Chen was quiet for another moment, then stood up abruptly. Clay, I need to show you something. Will you come with me to my office? Something in her tone made Clay's stomach clench with anxiety, but he followed her down the hallway to a small office lined with veterinary textbooks and family photos. Dr. Chen went to her desk and opened the bottom drawer, pulling out a manila, a folder that looked official and important. About 6 months ago, she said slowly, a man came to see me. He was asking about veterinarians in the area, said he was looking for someone who might have treated a brown and white mutt belonging to a man named Clay Hartwell. Clay's heart stopped. Thomas? He said his name was Thomas, yes. He was maybe 60 years old, tall like you, with the same eyes. He was thin, too thin, and he had a cough that worried me. Dr. Chen opened the folder and pulled out a business card. He left this, asked me to call him if you ever brought Dusty in for treatment. Clay took the card with shaking hands. Thomas Hartwell, custom furniture, it read, followed by an address in Missoula and a phone number. On the back, Thomas had written in his careful handwriting, "Please call day or night if my brother Clay comes to see you. I've been looking for him for 15 years. He was here," Clay whispered. "He was looking for me 6 months ago. And he came here. He spent 2 days in town," Dr. Chen continued gently. "He talked to every veterinarian, every feed store, every place that might have had contact with someone living rough with a dog. He showed everyone a photograph, an old picture of you from when you worked at the lumber mill. He said he'd hired investigators who thought you might be living in the mountains around here." Clay's vision blurred. While he'd been living like a ghost 20 miles away, Thomas had been walking these same streets, talking to these same people, never giving up hope that his lost brother might be found. They'd been so close, closer than they'd ever been since childhood, and Clay had never known. Did you call him?" Clay asked, though he dreaded the answer. Dr. Chen shook her head. "You never came in. I kept his card, kept hoping I'd have reason to use it, but you were taking care of Dusty on your own, and our paths never crossed until tonight." Clay stared at the business card, running his thumb over his brother's handwritten words. Thomas had been sick 6 months ago. Dr. Chen had noticed his cough, his weight loss. How sick was he now? Was he even still alive? "There's something else," Dr. Chen said quietly. She reached into the folder again and pulled out a newspaper clipping. "This ran in the Missoula paper 3 weeks ago. I kept it because I recognized the name." Clay took the clipping with numb fingers. It was an obituary, short and simple. Thomas Jack Hartwell, 60, of Missoula, died peacefully at Riverside Hospice on March 15th after a courageous battle with pancreatic cancer. Thomas was a gifted carpenter and furniture maker who owned Hartwell Custom Woodworks for over 20 years. He is survived by his brother Clay, whom he hoped to reunite with before his passing. In lieu of flowers, donations may be made to the Missing Person Network of Montana. Services will be held at Sunset Memorial Chapel on March 18th. The words on the page blurred and swam as Clay read them again and again, trying to make sense of what they meant. Thomas was dead. His brother, the brother who had spent 15 years looking for him, who had written hundreds of letters and hired investigators and never given up hope, was gone, and Clay had been too late. "I'm sorry," Dr. Chen said softly. "I should have shown you this right away. But I wanted you to know that he never stopped looking for you, that he loved you even though you'd never met." Clay couldn't speak. The business card shook in his hands as the full weight of his loss crashed over him. He'd found his brother too late, not by days or weeks, but by 3 weeks exactly. If Dusty had gotten sick a month earlier, if Clay had been paying attention to his companion's health, if he'd made different choices about when to come down from the mountains. "Clay," Dr. Chen said gently, "there's more." She pulled out another document from the folder, this one official-looking with legal letterhead. "The lawyer handling Thomas's estate came by yesterday. He's been trying to locate you. Apparently Thomas left specific instructions that if anything happened to him, his attorney should contact every veterinarian and medical facility in a 100-mile radius, looking for Clay Hartwell or anyone who might know you." Clay took the document with nerveless fingers. It was a letter from Peterson and Associates Attorneys at Law, addressed to any medical professional who may have treated Clay Hartwell or his dog Dusty. "Mr. Hartwell," the letter began, "we represent the estate of Thomas Jack Hartwell, who passed away on March 15th. Mr. Hartwell left specific instructions that we exhaust every possible avenue to locate his brother Clay Hartwell, as Mr. Hartwell is the sole beneficiary of his brother's estate. The estate includes real property, personal effects, and financial assets. If you have any information regarding Clay Hartwell, please contact our office immediately." Estate, beneficiary. The words didn't make sense to Clay's shocked mind. Thomas had left him something, not just the storage unit full of memories, but real property, money, a life's worth of accumulated belonging. "I don't understand," Clay said thickly. "We never even met. How could he leave me everything?" Dr. Chen's expression was infinitely gentle. "Because you were his family," she said simply. "Because love doesn't require meeting someone to be real." Clay set the papers down on Dr. Chen's desk and buried his face in his hands. The grief hit him like a physical blow. Not just the loss of Thomas, but the loss of everything they might have been to each other. All those years of letters, all that searching and hoping and never giving up, and in the end, they'd missed each other by 3 weeks. But even through the grief, other emotions were stirring. Confusion, because something about the obituary didn't make sense. Questions, because if Thomas had been looking for him for 15 years, how had he managed to accumulate an estate worth leaving? And underneath it all, a growing realization that there were pieces of this puzzle he still didn't understand. Dr. Chen seemed to sense his confusion. "Clay," she said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. When you found those documents in the storage unit, the ones about your childhood, did you look at all of them? Did you read everything Thomas left for you?" Clay shook his head. "I found the letters, the photographs, some childhood things. But there were other boxes I hadn't gotten to yet." "Why?" Dr. Chen picked up the obituary and pointed to a line Clay had missed in his initial shock. "Look at this again," she said. "Look at the full name." Clay read it again. Thomas Jack Hartwell. Thomas Jack. Not Thomas James, not Thomas William. Thomas Jack. Jack had been their father's name. "Your father's name was Jack Hartwell," Dr. Chen said quietly. "And this says Thomas Jack Hartwell. Clay, what if Thomas wasn't your half-brother? What if he wasn't your father's son from another relationship?" The implication hit Clay like lightning. If Thomas's middle name was Jack, named after their father, and if the obituary was accurate about his age, 60, not 58 like Clay had assumed from the letters, then Thomas had been older than Clay by more than 2 years. Much more. Clay's mind raced back to the documents he'd found, the birth certificates and court records that Thomas had gathered during his search. He'd been so focused on the emotional content of the letters that he hadn't paid attention to the legal details, the dates and names and relationships that would have told him the truth about their family. "I need to go back," Clay said suddenly, standing up so quickly he nearly knocked over his chair. "I need to go back to the storage unit and read everything. There's something I'm missing, something Thomas wanted me to understand." Dr. Chen nodded. "But not tonight," she said firmly. "Tonight you're going to stay here with Dusty, and tomorrow we're going to get him started on his treatment. The storage unit will still be there, and whatever Thomas left for you will still be there. But right. Now you need to process what you've learned, and Dusty needs to rest." Clay wanted to argue, wanted to rush back up the mountain immediately and tear through every box until he understood the truth about his family. But Dusty stirred on his bed and looked up at Clay with those trusting amber eyes. And Clay realized Dr. Chen was right. Whatever secrets Thomas had left for him had waited this long. They could wait one more night. But as he settled into Dr. Chen's office for the night, with Dusty sleeping peacefully nearby and the legal documents scattered on the desk, Clay couldn't shake the feeling that everything he thought he knew about his family, about his past, about who he really was about to change again, and this time the truth might be bigger than he was prepared to handle. Clay barely slept that night, his mind churning with questions and possibilities that wouldn't let him rest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Thomas's careful handwriting, heard the echo of words he'd never spoken to a brother he'd never met. When dawn finally broke over the mountains, Clay was already awake, sitting beside Dusty's bed and watching. His companion breathed steadily in the morning light. Dr. Chen arrived at the clinic early, carrying coffee and breakfast pastries that filled the office with the warm scent of cinnamon and hope. She took one look at Clay's haggard face and set a cup of coffee in front of him without comment. "How's Dusty this morning?" she asked, kneeling beside the dog bed. "Better," Clay said, and it was true. Dusty had slept through the night without restlessness, and his eyes looked brighter than they had in days. Whatever Dr. Chen had given him yesterday was already helping. "Good," she said, scratching behind Dusty's ears. "I'll start him on his medication regimen this morning. The kidney diet will take some getting used to, but I think he's going to do well with treatment." Clay nodded, grateful beyond words for her care. "Dr. Chen, I need to ask you something. Will you come with me to the storage unit today?" She looked up from Dusty, surprised. "You want me to come with you?" "I need someone there," Clay said quietly. "Someone who can help me understand what I'm reading, who can keep me grounded when I find out things that turn my whole life upside down again. I don't I don't trust myself to handle this alone anymore. It was the first time in 8 years. Clay had asked another human being for help with something that mattered, and the words felt strange in his mouth. But Dr. Chen just nodded as if such requests were perfectly normal. "Of course," she said. "I can close the clinic for the morning. This is more important." 2 hours later, they were driving up the mountain road in Dr. Chen's truck with Dusty, resting comfortably in the back seat on a pile of blankets. Clay directed her to the mining camp, his stomach tight with anticipation and dread. Whatever he found in those remaining boxes would either complete the picture Thomas had been trying to paint, or shatter what little understanding Clay thought he'd gained about his family. The storage unit looked exactly as he'd left it, though somehow smaller than it had seemed when he'd been exploring it alone. Dr. Chen helped him carry the unopened boxes outside into the morning sunlight, where they could spread the contents on a tarp and examine everything systematically. "Where do we start?" Dr. Chen asked, surveying the collection of cardboard boxes and manila folders. Clay pointed to a box labeled legal documents that he'd noticed but hadn't opened yet. "There," he said. "If Thomas was trying to tell me something about our family, the truth will be in there." The box was heavier than the others, packed with file folders arranged in careful chronological order. Clay opened the first folder and found himself looking at his own birth certificate, the official one, not a copy. His hands trembled as he read the details he'd never seen before. Clay James, Hartwell, born June 15, 1967, in Billings, Montana. Mother, Sarah Rose Hartwell. Father, listed as unknown. Unknown? Clay stared at the document. "But I grew up with Jack Hartwell. He was my father. He raised me. He had the same last name." Dr. Chen took the birth certificate gently from his hands and studied it. "Clay, this is your original birth certificate, but look at this." She pointed to a stamp at the bottom. "This was amended. There should be an amended version somewhere in here." They found it in the next folder, a second birth certificate with the same information, except the father line now read Jack William Hartwell instead of unknown. The amendment was dated 6 months after Clay's original birth certificate. "Jack adopted you," Dr. Chen said quietly. 6 months after you were born, he legally adopted you and gave you his name." Clay's world tilted again. If Jack had adopted him, that meant Jack wasn't his biological father, which meant Thomas wasn't his half-brother through Jack. They might not be related to Jack at all. With growing urgency, Clay reached for Thomas's birth certificate. The document was older, yellowed with age. Thomas Jack Hartwell, born March 8, 1965. Mother, Sarah Rose Hartwell. Father, unknown. The same unknown father, the same mother. Dr. Chen was reading over his shoulder, and Clay heard her sharp intake of breath as she made the same connection he had. "Clay," she said softly, "you and Thomas are full brothers." "Same mother, same unknown father. Jack Hartwell adopted both of you." But that couldn't be right. Clay's memories, what few he had, were of living with Jack from early childhood. He'd always been told that Jack was his father, that Sarah had been Jack's wife, that they'd been a normal family until his mother died when he was 6. Clay reached for another folder, this one labeled Marriage Divorce Records. Inside, he found documents that rewrote his understanding of everything. Sarah Rose McCarthy had married Jack William Hartwell on June 20th, 1967, 5 days after Clay was born. Not before Thomas's birth in 1965, not during some previous relationship, but after both boys were already born. The marriage certificate listed Sarah as having 2 children, Thomas Jack McCarthy, age 2, and Clay James McCarthy, age 5 days. McCarthy. Clay's original name had been McCarthy, not Hartwell. And Thomas had been born a McCarthy too, not a Hartwell. They were brothers, full brothers, and Jack Hartwell had married their mother and adopted them both. "Why don't I remember any of this?" Clay asked, his voice strained. "Why do I remember living with Jack as my father from the beginning?" Dr. Chen was studying another document, her brow furrowed. "Clay, look at this." It's a custody agreement from 1973. The custody agreement was between Sarah Rose Hartwell and someone named David McCarthy, their biological father, Clay realized with a shock. According to the document, David McCarthy had been granted supervised visitation rights with his sons, Thomas and Jimmy McCarthy, also known as Thomas and Clay Hartwell. Jimmy? There was that name again, the name from the childhood photographs, the name Clay couldn't remember being called. Your father, your biological father, was fighting for custody, Dr. Chen said, scanning the legal language. It says here that Sarah was trying to keep the boys away from him, that there were allegations of domestic violence and substance abuse. Clay found more documents, court records that painted a disturbing picture. David McCarthy had been an alcoholic with a violent temper who had terrorized Sarah during their relationship. When Sarah finally left him, taking 2-year-old Thomas and infant Clay with her, David had begun a legal battle that lasted for years. Look at this, Dr. Chen said, pointing to a restraining order dated 1972. Sarah was trying to protect you and Thomas from your biological father. It says here that David had threatened to take the boys away from her, that he'd been following the family and making threats. A police report from 1973 filled in more details. David McCarthy had been arrested for violating the restraining order, for breaking into Jack and Sarah's home and attempting to take 6-year-old Clay, Jimmy, from his bed in the middle of the night. Sarah had called the police, but not before David had gotten Clay into his car and driven away. Clay's hands were shaking as he read the report. This was it. This was the night his life had changed, the night that explained why he couldn't remember. Thomas? Why his earliest memories were of living alone with Jack in Great Falls. He took you, Dr. Chen said quietly. Your biological father kidnapped you when you were 6 years old. Look, it says here that the police found you 3 days. Later at a truck stop in Great Falls, David McCarthy had abandoned you there and disappeared. Another document explained what happened next. Sarah had been frantic, but by the time the police found Clay, he was traumatized and confused. A psychiatrist's report noted that the child was suffering from acute stress reaction and seemed to have blocked out memories of his life before the kidnapping. Social services recommended that he be placed with Jack Hartwell, his legal adoptive father, while Sarah recovered from her own trauma. But Sarah never recovered. Clay found her death certificate in the next folder. Sarah Rose Hartwell died July 23, 1973, acute myocardial infarction, heart attack. She had died of a heart attack just 2 months after Clay was kidnapped, probably brought on by the stress and terror of nearly losing her child. She died of a broken heart, Clay whispered. She died thinking she'd failed to protect us. The final piece of the puzzle was in a folder labeled Custody, Thomas. After Sarah's death, custody of Thomas had gone to Sarah's mother, Grandma, Rose, the woman in the nursing home photograph who remembered both boys, who had tried to keep the family together. But Jack Hartwell, as Clay's legal adoptive father, had been awarded custody of Clay alone. Jack took you to Great Falls and started over, Dr. Chen said, reading through the final documents. Changed your name from Jimmy to Clay, told you he was your biological father. Never mentioned Thomas or Sarah's family again. He was trying to protect you, to give you a normal life away from all the trauma. Clay sat back on his heels, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd discovered. He and Thomas were full brothers who had been separated by violence and tragedy, not choice. Jack Hartwell had been a good man who had married their mother to protect her and her children, who had legally adopted them and tried to give them a stable home. When David McCarthy, their real father, had nearly destroyed their family, Jack had done what he thought was best. He'd taken Clay away from all the pain and started fresh, never imagining that someday Thomas would grow up wondering what had happened to his little brother Jimmy. Thomas never stopped looking for you because he remembered, Dr. Chen said softly. He remembered having a little brother. He remembered you being taken away. And he spent his whole life trying to find you and bring you home. Clay picked up the small wooden horse he'd found the day before, the toy that had Thomas's childhood name carved into its base. His brother had kept this, had treasured it, had saved it for 60 years, hoping that someday he could share it with the brother who had been stolen away in the middle of the night. And now Thomas was gone, buried 3 weeks ago, while Clay had been living 20 miles away, never knowing that the family he'd spent his whole life missing had been missing him too. But Thomas had left one final gift, more than the storage unit, more than the letters and photographs and childhood memories. Thomas had left the truth, and with that truth came a decision Clay had to make. Would he honor his brother's memory by finally accepting the belonging Thomas had always offered him? In his pocket, Clay still carried the key to Thomas's mountain cabin, the home his brother had fixed up, hoping they might spend time there together. It was too late for the reunion Thomas had dreamed of, but maybe it wasn't too late for Clay to finally come home. Among the final documents in Thomas's carefully organized collection, Clay found something that made his breath catch in his throat. A small digital recorder, the kind used for dictation, wrapped in a cloth bag with a note attached. For Clay, the note read in Thomas's familiar handwriting, "In case we never get to talk face to face, everything I wanted to tell you is on here. Please listen when you're ready. Your brother Thomas." Clay held the recorder in his shaking hands, staring at it as if it might explode. This was Thomas's voice, Thomas's words, the conversations they'd never had preserved in digital format. Dr. Chen sat beside him on the top, Dusty resting peacefully between them, all of them surrounded by the scattered evidence of a family's complicated history. "Do you want to listen to it now?" Dr. Chen asked gently. Clay nodded, not trusting his voice. He pressed the play button with a trembling finger, and suddenly his brother's voice filled the quiet mountain air. "Hello, Clay. If you're hearing this, then you found the storage unit, and you've probably figured out by now that our family story is more complicated than either of us knew when we were kids." The voice was warm and deep, with a slight roughness that spoke of years and experience. It sounded like Clay's own voice, but gentler somehow, more at peace with the world. "I'm making this recording in case I don't get to meet you face to face," Thomas continued. "My doctor says I've got maybe 6 months left, maybe less, and I wanted to make sure you heard these things from me, not from lawyers or social workers or anybody else who might try to explain our family but doesn't really understand what it meant." Clay closed his eyes, trying to picture the man behind the voice. Thomas had been sick when he made this recording, probably knowing he was dying, but he'd taken the time to speak to the brother he'd never met. "First thing I want you to know is that I remember you, Jimmy. I remember everything about our life before Dad, before our real dad, David, took you away. I remember how you used to follow me around Grandma Rose's house, trying to do everything I did. I remember teaching you to tie your shoes and how proud you were when you finally got it right. I remember you sleeping in my bed when you had nightmares, and how you used to steal my toys, but I didn't mind, because sharing with you made me feel important." Tears were streaming down Clay's face now, though he wasn't aware of them. These weren't just memories, they were love letters from the past, proof that he'd been cherished and missed and never forgotten. "I remember the morning Dad took you away," Thomas's voice continued, quieter now. "You were so scared, Clay. You kept calling for Mama and for me, and I tried to follow the car, but I was only 8 and I couldn't keep up. I ran all the way to the main road crying your name, and when the police found me hours later, I kept telling them they had to bring Jimmy back, that you belonged with us." Dr. Chen reached over and squeezed Clay's hand, anchoring him to the present, as Thomas's voice carried him back to a trauma he'd blocked out for 52 years. "Grandma Rose tried to get you back, tried to fight the courts, but Jack thought it was better for you to start fresh somewhere else. Maybe he was right. Maybe you needed to forget all the bad stuff that happened with our real dad, but I never forgot you, Jimmy, not for one single day." The recording paused, and Clay could hear Thomas taking a shaky breath before continuing. "I want you to know about Mama. She loved us so much, Clay. She used to sing to us at night, old country songs that her mama sang to her. Her favorite was Wildwood Flower, and sometimes when I play it on the guitar now, I swear I can still hear her voice harmonizing along. She never got over losing you. The doctors said her heart just gave out, but I think she died of missing you, of blaming herself for not protecting you better. Clay was sobbing now, great wrenching sounds that seemed to come from some deep well of grief he'd been carrying all his life without knowing it. Dr. Chen's arm came around his shoulders, offering comfort while he grieved for the mother he couldn't remember but who had loved him enough to die of missing him. But here's the thing I really need you to understand, Thomas continued, his voice stronger now. None of what happened was your fault, and none of it was Mama's fault either. We were just kids caught up in an adult world that got ugly and dangerous. Jack Hartwell saved your life by taking you away from all that mess. I've never blamed him for that, even though it meant I lost my little brother. The recording continued, with Thomas sharing memories Clay couldn't access, stories of birthday parties and fishing trips, of Christmas mornings and summer afternoons, spent building forts in the woods behind Grandma Rose's house. Each memory was a gift, a piece of childhood that Thomas had preserved for both of them through 50 years of separation. I've been looking for you for 15 years, Clay, but not. Because I wanted to drag you back into the past. I wanted to find you because I wanted you to know that you were loved, that you belonged somewhere, that you had a family who never stopped missing you. Even if we never meet, even if you decide you don't want to know me, I needed you to understand that you were never alone in this world. I was always out here, always hoping, always keeping a place for you in my heart. Thomas's voice broke slightly on those last words, and Clay could hear the emotion that had driven 15 years of searching, 15 years of never giving up hope. I'm leaving you everything, Clay. The cabin, the business, what little money I've saved. It's all yours because you're my family, my brother, the little boy I lost and never stopped loving. But more than any of that, I'm leaving you the truth about who you are and where you came from. You're not just Clay Hartwell, the man who survived alone in the mountains. You're Jimmy McCarthy, who was loved and missed and mourned and celebrated every single day of his life by the brother who remembered him. The recording continued, and Thomas's voice grew warmer as he shifted from painful memories to present gifts. Now, if you're ready to hear about the practical stuff, Thomas said, and Clay could hear a smile in his voice. I need to tell you about what I'm leaving you. There's a cabin about 40 miles north of where you found this storage unit. I bought the land 15 years ago, right after I started looking for you, because I had this crazy idea that maybe someday we'd spend time there together. Clay wiped his eyes and looked at Dr. Chen, who was listening intently to every word. She squeezed his shoulder encouragingly. The cabin's not much to look at from the outside, Thomas continued, but I've spent years fixing it up, making it into the kind of place I thought you might like. There's a workshop where I make furniture, or where you could do whatever kind of work makes you happy. There's a garden plot that gets good sun most of the day, and a creek that runs year-round, about 50 yards behind the house. The fishing's pretty good if you're inclined toward that sort of thing. Thomas paused, and Clay could hear papers rustling in the background. I'm including a map to the cabin and all the legal documents you'll need. The property's paid for, free and clear, and there's enough money in the bank to cover taxes and maintenance for a good long while. I know you've been living rough, Clay, and I respect that choice, but I wanted you to have options. Sometimes a man needs a place to come home to, even if he doesn't realize it at the time. The kindness in Thomas's voice was overwhelming. Even facing death, even knowing he'd never meet the brother he'd searched for so long, Thomas had been thinking about Clay's future, about giving him choices and possibilities. There's something else, Thomas said, his voice taking on a different tone. Something I hope you'll consider, even though I know it might be hard. There are keys to my truck and my business in Missoula. Hartwell Custom Woodworks has been my life for 20 years. And I've built up a good reputation, a good clientele. I was hoping maybe you'd be interested in keeping it going. Clay's breath caught. a business. Thomas was offering him not just a home, but a livelihood, a way to be part of the world again. "I know you might not know anything about woodworking," Thomas continued, "but I left detailed instructions for every project, every technique I've learned over the years. And my business partner, Jake, he's a good man, Clay, the kind of friend everyone deserves. He's agreed to help you learn the trade if you're interested. No pressure, no expectations. But if you want to carry on the Hartwell name in woodworking, the opportunity's there." The recording paused again, longer this time, and when Thomas spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "I wish I could be there to show you all of this myself, Clay. I wish I could teach you to use the tools, could show you how to read wood grain and choose the right joinery for each piece. I wish we could work side by side in that shop, making things with our hands, and talking about everything we missed over the years." Clay closed his eyes, trying to imagine it, standing in a workshop with the brother he'd never known, learning skills that had been in their family, creating something beautiful and useful together. "But even if that can't happen," Thomas continued, "I want you to know that every piece of furniture I ever made, I was thinking about you. Every table, every cabinet, every rocking chair, they were all made by a man who had a brother somewhere in the world, and that made the work mean something more." The recording quality changed slightly, and Clay realized Thomas must have started a new session, maybe days or weeks later. "Clay, I need to tell you one more thing, and this might be the most important thing of all. I've been angry for a lot of years. Angry at our real dad for what he did to our family, angry at Jack for taking you away, angry at the whole world for keeping us apart. But making this recording, gathering all these things for you, I've realized something. The anger doesn't serve anybody. It doesn't bring back the years we lost, and it doesn't honor the love Mama had for both of us." Thomas's voice was steady, now filled with a peace that Clay envied. "So I'm choosing to forgive all of it, Clay. I'm forgiving David for being a broken man who broke our family. I'm forgiving Jack for doing what he thought was best, even though it cost us each other. And most of all, I'm forgiving myself for not finding you sooner, for not being the big brother you needed when we were separated." Clay felt something shift in his chest. Not the cracking open he'd experienced before, but something settling into place, like a bone healing correctly after being set. "I hope you can find that forgiveness too, Jimmy. Not because anybody deserves it, but because you deserve to be free from carrying anger that isn't yours to bear. You deserve to live the rest of your life knowing you were loved, you were wanted, and you always had a place in this world where you belonged." The recording ended there, leaving Clay sitting in the mountain silence with his brother's final gift, permission to let go of a lifetime of wondering why he'd always felt so alone, and an invitation to step into the belonging Thomas had been trying to offer him for 15 years. In his hands, Clay held the keys to Thomas's cabin, Thomas's truck, Thomas's life, keys to a future he'd never imagined possible. The question now was whether he had the courage to use them. 6 months later, Clay Hartwell stood in the workshop behind his cabin, running his weathered hands over the smooth surface of a dining table he'd spent 3 weeks crafting. The wood was local pine, honey-colored and fragrant, shaped into something that would serve a family for generations. It wasn't perfect. His joinery still showed the hesitation of a man learning a new craft at 58, but it was solid, beautiful, and made with the kind of care Thomas had tried to teach him through detailed notebooks and patient instruction from Jake Peterson. Jake had been Thomas's business partner for 8 years, a quiet man in his 40s who'd known immediately that Clay was Thomas's brother the moment he'd walked into Hartwell Custom Woodworks that first day. "You've got his hands," Jake had said simply, "and his stubborn streak when it comes to getting a piece just right." Learning the business had been like learning a new language, but Clay had discovered he had an aptitude for working with wood that felt almost genetic. His hands seemed to remember skills he'd never learned, and sometimes, when he was absorbed in shaping a piece, he could almost hear Thomas's voice guiding him through the more difficult techniques. The cabin had become home in a way Clay had forgotten was possible. It was everything Thomas had promised, a place where a man could belong without having to explain himself, where the morning coffee tasted better because you were drinking it on your own porch, looking out over land that was yours to tend and protect. The garden Thomas had started was flourishing under Clay's care, and the small packets of seeds he'd found with a note reading, "For Clay, plant these when you're ready to put down roots," had grown into tomatoes and squash and herbs that reminded him of flavors from a childhood he was slowly remembering. Dusty had recovered his health and vitality with proper treatment, and now spent his days exploring the property and greeting the occasional customers who came to the cabin to commission furniture. Dr. Chen visited regularly, both to check on Dusty and to share meals with Clay, a friendship that had grown naturally from their shared experience of discovering Thomas's story. She'd helped Clay navigate the legal complexities of inheriting his brother's estate, and she'd been there the day he'd driven to Sunset Memorial Chapel to visit Thomas's grave for the first time. That had been the hardest day since finding the storage unit. Clay had stood beside the simple granite headstone that read Thomas Jack Hartwell, beloved brother, and felt the full weight of everything they'd lost and everything they'd found. He'd brought the wooden horse from Thomas's childhood, the toy that had survived 60 years of separation, and he'd placed it gently on the grave. "I'm sorry I was too late," he'd whispered to the stone, "but I'm here now. I'm home." This morning, Clay was expecting visitors. Jake was bringing a young couple from Kalispell who wanted to commission a nursery set for their first child, and Dr. Chen was stopping by afterward to check on Dusty and stay for dinner. It was the kind of normal human interaction that would have terrified Clay a year ago, but now felt like the natural rhythm of a life lived in connection with others. As he cleaned his tools and prepared to close the workshop for the day, Clay noticed a small wrapped package on his workbench that hadn't been there earlier. His heart skipped. Sometimes Jake left supplies or notes, but this looked different, personal. Clay unwrapped the package carefully and found himself holding a collection of seeds in small paper packets, each one labeled in handwriting he didn't recognize. The accompanying note was from Grandma Rose's great-niece, a woman named Mary, who had contacted Clay through the lawyer handling Thomas's estate. "Dear Clay," the note read, "Great Aunt Rose passed peacefully last month at age 94. Before she died, she asked me to send you these seeds from her garden, the same flowers and vegetables she grew when you and Thomas were little boys. She said she'd been saving them for 60 years, hoping someday her little Jimmy would come home and want to plant them. She never stopped believing she'd see you again, and I think she did in her own way. These seeds are her love, still growing after all these years." Clay's vision blurred as he read the names on the seed packets: Morning Glories, Black-Eyed Susans, Green Beans, Sweet Corn. Each packet was a memory he couldn't quite access but somehow recognized, a connection to the grandmother who had loved him and remembered him and never given up hope. He walked outside to the garden plot Thomas had prepared, where the late afternoon sun slanted golden through the pine trees, and Dusty was stretched out in a warm patch of earth, content and healthy. This was where he would plant Grandma Rose's seeds, where he would tend something that connected him to the family he'd lost and found and lost and found again. As Clay knelt in the rich soil and began to prepare the ground for planting, he thought about Thomas's voice on that recording, about forgiveness and belonging and the courage to accept love even when it comes too late to be perfect. He thought about Dr. Chen's kindness, about Jake's patient teaching, about the customers who trusted him to make furniture for their families, even though he was still learning. Most of all, he thought about Dusty, who had led him to that storage unit 6 months ago and changed everything. His faithful companion, who had somehow known that Clay needed to find those letters, those photographs, that carefully preserved evidence of a love that had never died, even when everything else fell apart. The seeds went into the ground with ceremony, each one a prayer for growth, for connection, for the possibility that love could survive separation and loss and still bloom when the conditions were finally right. As the sun set behind the mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Clay Hartwell, who had once been little Jimmy McCarthy, finally understood what Thomas had been trying to tell him all along. Sometimes it takes a lifetime to find your way home, but when you finally do, when you finally accept the love that's been waiting for you all along, the seeds of belonging can grow anywhere.